Okay, so what we're going to have a bit of a chat about to start today is tactics, and in particular tactics in British parliamentary debating. I want this to be a fairly interactive session, so I've got some notes, but then they're kind of guidance more than anything else. And if there's anything that you want to explore in a little bit more detail, we'll do that. To start off with, there's one big part of British parliamentary debating, one kind of stylistic element of the format that has a particularly big impact on the tactics that you run, and that's the reality that you have two teams on the same side. So obviously a lot of formats out there where you don't, and it's just one team per side arguing, and the tactics as a result are a little less obvious and a little less kind of complicated in those kind of debates. That element of trying to beat a team that's on the same side as you is definitely the most tricky tactical part of British parliamentary debating, and that's definitely where we're going to focus. But we can obviously kind of dig in a little bit more into some of the other areas depending on what people want to talk about. In my opinion, at least, there are kind of three things that having another team on your side means, or three things that it affects. The first is the way that you position yourself in the debate. So you can't just say, we're going to make the debate about this particular issue because we think it's a really interesting one. You have to position yourself to be the team that has the thing that the judge will think is the most interesting issue in the debate. So it forces you to think much more actively, not just about what arguments you want to run in the debate, but what arguments you have to run, because otherwise someone else will and they'll beat you. So obviously I did quite a lot of debating in Austral's format where there's only one team on each side, and you can just choose to make the debate about something that you want it to be about. And you have the flexibility to do that to a much greater extent. Not as true in British parliamentary debating. The second thing that it kind of affects is the way that you engage with other teams. So again, in styles where you don't have another team on your bench, you can beat the team directly opposite you and then kind of call it a day. You can settle down, you kind of feel like you've beaten their arguments, you could focus in on doing things that you find kind of interesting to talk about rather than kind of rehashing rebuttal. You don't get the option to do that in a debate where there's another team not only on your side but on the other side. So it changes the dynamics there. And finally, it forces you to just have more presence in the debate. So Pairwise becomes so much more important when they might be the only chance you have to directly engage with another team. So it really does shift the ways in which you have to start engaging with other teams in the debate. And that's what we're going to dig into today, those kind of areas of change. And what I'm going to try and teach you are some basic tools that you can use when it comes to writing points of information, when it comes to writing extensions, and when it comes to the tactics that you use in the opening half of the debate, which Miri, I think you mentioned last night as something that you wanted to spend some time talking about. Most importantly, though, I want to give you a bit of an awareness about why you would go about using those things and when they'd be appropriate in any given debate, and therefore why you'd choose to use them. So I'm going to start this. Let's talk firstly about how you win from each half of the debate. If you're an opening team, what do you have to do to win the debate? It's not a trick question. What things in general do you have to do as an opening team? Yeah.
Opening government or opening opposition?
Either one. Yep.
You have to provide a metric for why what you're implementing is good and try to create arguments that cater to all the major clashes and questions within the debate.
Yep, so there's kind of two things there. So the first of those is finding the core arguments of the motion, so delivering some of the most important arguments in the debate. But it's also, as Elizabeth said, it's about finding the importance of those arguments. It's not enough to just run an argument, you've got to also be able to explain why that argument is debate winning. And that's when you come to creating metrics, right? So the way that you should judge this debate is on these two criteria. We should do this policy if the following things are true. Now I'm going to show you why. And linking everything together in that way becomes really important at opening half, because if you convince the judge of what the metric for judging the debate is, it's very hard for the closing half to move away from your material, because you've convinced the judge that your material is the most relevant in the debate. What else do you have to do? You all do it.
To make sure you stay relevant throughout the debate?
Right, yeah, absolutely. So you have to engage all the way through the debate. And that is a mistake a lot of opening half teams do. They kind of finish their speeches, sit down, and then occasionally offer a POI and feel like that's their job done. But it is much more than that. You want to maintain a presence throughout the debate. What else? What about the teams opposite you?
Well, you should try to beat them.
Yeah, you don't want to leave lots of material standing from the team directly opposite you, because that's something that's going to leave lots of space for your closing half to move in new and interesting directions away from where you were. There's one final thing, which I think a lot of people don't think about, which is to prevent the team on the diagonal from you from building too much momentum. So if you're opening gov and opening and closing opposition asks you a POI, you want to give the sense that you would beat them, right? You want to give the sense that if there was an actual chance for you to head-to-head respond to them, you would come out ahead. So it's really important that those few moments of engagement you get with that team diagonally opposite you, that you use those to their full effect. Because when it comes to a judge sitting in the judging room after the debate, talking with the rest of their panel, and they say, oh, there was, OG was doing so well, but closing op did do some real damage to their case. How are we going to weigh that? The fact that when you had the opportunity to respond, you beat them is going to be a particularly important thing. Whereas if you have the opportunity to respond and you do a bad job doing that, then it's more likely that they'll lean towards that closing team. So it is really important to think about some of those dynamics as you develop. What about from closing half? What do you have to do? Yes. Yeah, so you want to find some relevant issue that you can make the most important thing in the debate, and you have to delineate it, you have to make it different, and you also have to make it sound important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those two things later on. What else?
Engage with the opening teams.
Yep. So you want to make sure that you're rebutting them, eliminating any kind of standing points that have kind of... If you're the closing gov, you want to make sure that anything the opening op has said, that the opening gov's done a bad job dealing with, that you've been able to respond to that and deal with that. Anything else?
Be very comparative.
Yeah.
Is it the same as delineate?
Yeah, it is to some extent. You do want to compare those arguments as part of that, but it can go beyond that. There are some other things. What about the other closing half team?
Well, obviously beat it.
Yeah, so you want to beat their extension, because you don't want them to be able to build up lots of momentum around that. And you also want to build some momentum through your POIs in the opening half. You want the judge to be waiting to hear what you have to say, rather than sitting there feeling like the debate's going quite well without you. You want them to feel like you're going to have the most important contribution.
On that, a lot of teams refuse to actually give away their extension in POIs because it could...
So it's a balance.
Yeah.
And it depends how kind of obvious the POI is. So definitely, if you're closing opposition, you don't want to stand up and ask the Prime Minister a question that gives away the entire extension that you wanted to run, right? You don't want to give away material like that, because your opening, if they're at all intelligent, will take it from you. So you do have some limitations, but you might be much more willing to ask a POI that reveals your extension when both speakers that are ahead of you have already spoken. So you should be doing that, because that's a way to build momentum. But you might also have POIs that are a bit more of a trap. So there's a great example that someone writes about in one of the old MDR issues. So there's a debate about about creating an ASEAN parliament. So ASEAN is kind of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, creating a parliament for that body. And closing opposition stands up and asks the Prime Minister, would votes be proportional to population, or would each country have their own vote? Right? And the Prime Minister goes, well, that seems very silly. I don't see why that would be relevant, but for the sake of it, let's go proportional. Now, proportional means that Indonesia gets 260 votes and Brunei gets 1. So there are ways that you might build momentum that don't actually give away your extension, but because of knowledge that you have, or certain types of arguments that you want to run, they draw that opening team into some concessions they don't realise that they're making, or push everyone else into making arguments that you can then make use of later in the debate. So there are ways that you might flag your extension without actually flagging your extension that might not be obvious until you stand up. And thinking about what those are and guiding people to the point where they're running the kind of material that you want them running can be really important. The last thing you want to do at closing is stand up and say, look, opening was really unclear about whether they do this or this, and we're just going to assume that it's the one that favours our case, right? Because your judge is going to go, well, is it? I don't know. Whereas if you've asked that question early on and set them up for you to do that, that's really important. So there are a variety of ways you might do that, and we'll talk about some of those right now, in fact. We talk about points of information. People tend to be, I think, a little bit lazy about points of information without realizing it. You kind of talk to people and they're like, oh, I write them down. And that's kind of the end of it. A point of information is such a targeted 15-second opportunity to speak. So you should have every word of that written down as like a minimum standard. You should have it planned out, because the last thing you want to do is waste some of that time by fumbling it. You don't have time to build up momentum. So you've got to make sure that POI hits within that 15 seconds, doesn't go on for too long, doesn't miss the point because of how you've structured it. And this is something that I used to be terrible at. I used to structure POIs that were kind of double-barreled, and I'd get to the end of the first barrel and they'd say, yeah, I've got your point. So you've got to think about how that POI is going to be received and how it's in a place. That's really important. You can't build an entire argument into one. People try and do that. Don't do that. The point of a POI is to emphasize the things that you think you'll win on. I mean, obviously the other team is going to try and dodge the question, right? Like, they're not going to give the answer that you want them to give, or at least they're going to try not to do that. So you've got to think a little bit about how you build a POI that draws them into assuming that the answer they're giving is the safe one. But you've also got to remember that if you just stand up and say, we had this argument, can you please respond to it? Chances are they'll respond to it by saying, yeah, I spoke about that earlier. Or, yeah, my partner already dealt with that. Here's a very quick plotted summary why. So you've got to lead them towards something a little bit more specific. I think a lot of POIs tend to be quite vague. The more specific and targeted they are, usually, the better they tend to be. Your POIs, I think, should fulfill one of two roles in general. The first of those is flagging something that's important to the adjudicator. So you don't care what the response of the team is, right? You think they'll probably try and dodge the question, but for whatever reason, you think something needs to be drawn to the attention of the adjudicator in the debate. That might be an argument you're about to present. So you might be a closing half team about to stand up and offer an extension, and you just want to flag it and get it percolating in the adjudicator's mind. So you might just stand up and say, don't you think this? And they'll go, no, we don't. But the adjudicator's already started thinking about it. You might flag an argument that you've presented that they haven't dealt with. So just reminding the adjudicator of a lack of engagement from the other side. And that might be an argument that, so you might be an opening half team saying, well, your opening hasn't responded to this. You still haven't responded to this. Will you please respond to my argument? And all you're really doing there is saying, notice me, right? We're still here. We still had arguments. Those arguments were interesting. So, yeah.
What if they then say, well, I already dealt with it? Is it maybe more, does it maybe make more sense instead of saying, this was the argument, can you respond to it, to maybe say the core of the argumentation, and then make it seem as if...
Yeah, so you might do a more complicated way of framing it, right? And particularly if they have responded to it badly, you might emphasize the failure of that responsiveness. But what you're doing here is often actually just pointing out to the adjudicator that something's there, and you're hoping that the adjudicator kind of understands that when you do that. And then obviously, finally, you might be pointing out just a tension or a problem in their case, right? So you're saying this, your opening said this, how do you reconcile them? And you don't really expect them to be able to answer that. You don't really expect them to be like, oh yeah, here's the reconciliation. All you're actually doing is getting the adjudicator to notice that that's there. Does that make sense? Second way you might be doing it is to force them to deal with something they're trying to avoid. So that's kind of the other end of Melanie's question, right? So sometimes you might genuinely think that they need to respond to an argument. It's not just a matter of flagging it up to the adjudicator. They've tried to avoid it again and again. You want to force them, corner them into making some responses. That's usually because you think those responses will be useful to you. You think whatever they say will make it easier for you to win the debate. So that might be your material. It might be linking some of their material to a rebuttal that you've provided or an argument that you already made. So if you're an opening government team, you might stand up and say, you're making this argument, but my first argument at deputy was this. Doesn't that already respond to that? And all you're doing is trying to force them to engage fully in your material rather than just focusing on their own. And you might be asking them to deal with one of those tricky kind of trap questions, right? So an extension of the position that they're taking that creates problems for them in some way. So that ASEAN Parliament question is a really good example of it. You think this isn't the logical extension of this, and you might phrase that in a quite innocuous way. So you might hide it in kind of, is it proportional or not? Or for that matter, one really commonly used example is a World's quarterfinal about electing judges from many years ago, where the opening government team was asked, how often will you re-elect judges? And they went, oh, that seems a little bit kind of weirdly fussy, but sure, for the sake of it, let's say every 4 years. What they were actually conceding in that was that they would be re-electing judges, that it wouldn't be an election for life. And that was what the closing opposition was planning on framing their extension around. So there might be ways that you're hiding that, but what you're essentially trying to do is draw them into making a concession they don't realise that they're making. So those are the kind of things you should be keeping in mind, and you should, when you're asking a POI, you should know what answer you want, right? And your framing should be about how you make them give you that answer. So that might be the answer that you want is one that just reveals that their analysis doesn't work, right? So you might point out an argument that you've made expecting them to rehash the same response that they've been running, but you've framed the POI to make it quite obvious that response doesn't work, right? So there might be ways that you're framing and writing your points of information to make that work in that way. So, tactics from opening and closing half when it comes to points of information. In opening half, you might be asking some trap POIs early on, right? So the Prime Minister and the opposition leader might get a few points of information that are about guiding them into a situation that's hard for them to respond to. Most of what you're doing is reasserting your material, because most of the POIs you'll get an opportunity to ask are in the closing half, and you've no longer got a chance to build on top of that. So asking a trap POI just sets up a potential argument for your closing to use. It doesn't necessarily give you the benefit of that because you don't have the opportunity to follow through and explain why that was a trap. So most of what you're going to be doing is flagging up your material because of the nature of your role, or using your material to point to problems in the closing half case, or claiming ownership of the material that your own closing half team has run. So saying, our closings run this extension, we also made this argument, can you please respond to it? Yep, so using things like that to try and claim ownership of material that's coming out. It gets more complicated in closing half because you get an opportunity to ask a greater range of points of information because you're responding to them later. You have more time to plan a strategy that runs across the debate. So you obviously want to dominate the opening half of the debate. You want to give the adjudicator the sense that you have the most nuanced understanding of the arguments that are being made, but you also don't want to give away material when you do it. And that's a really tricky balance in opening half, and a lot of teams struggle with it. I generally suggest that the best tip is to actually ask points of information that reframe your opening half's material, or a logical extension of your opening half's material in the best possible wording, right? Because you really don't want to give too much away at that point. You just want to show that you have more understanding of the material than your opening does.
Do you have an example for how that would work?
So let's say your opening's made a quite vague argument about role of government, right? So they've said, this is a debate about smoking, we think the role of government is to protect people, and they haven't really done the analysis much more than that. You can go, well, they've made that argument, that's clearly the depth with which they intend to make that argument, so it's safe for me to ask a POI that says, in society, we generally believe that in return for paying taxes to the government will go out of its way to protect us. In particular, it might do that even where we're harming ourselves. Therefore, isn't it the role of the government to step in here? So you might just provide more detail, or you might add a bit of nuance. Maybe they might have explained something in quite a jumbled way. So you kind of know what the point is because you know what argument they're trying to make, but it's not very clear. So your point of information is 15 seconds for you to explain that in a better way than they have. So it's those kind of opportunities that you want to be taking in opening half, much more than you want to be revealing your own material, unless you think you can make that oblique enough. So questions like, how often will you re-elect judges? Does that make sense? The kind of tactic for those trap POIs, I don't know if anyone's kind of heard the infamous kind of question that gets used as an example of a kind of trap assumption. So the question, when did you stop beating your wife? Which assumes that you started beating your wife at some point. There was a time when you were doing that, and the kind of trap of it is people go, 3 years ago, right? So the question is framed as a getting you to admit to something by answering a question that's actually a step removed that assumes a premise. And those are often the kind of traps that you end up asking. So when did you beat your wife? How often will you re-elect judges? They both have the same basic format. So obviously part of it is about the strategy that you use in opening half. When it comes to closing half, you obviously have a lot more freedom. There's no one after you who might make better use of a POI than you did. So you really can ask anything at that point, but it does mean that you have to be kind of inserting your extension, giving a bit of a sense of where you're going, and also you have very little time to ask POIs by the time that you've revealed your extension. So if you're closing opposition, and you don't want to flag your extension until as soon as you stand up, you'll have one speaker after your extension to ask Pairwise. So if there are any traps that you want to set, you have to think about how you set them earlier, because you won't get a chance after you've delivered your extension. In a lot of cases, you might not even get taken for a POI. At that point, your opening might get both of them. So thinking a little bit about how you build that can be really important. Any questions about POIs? Yeah.
Do you recommend a certain strategy in taking them? Because there are a lot of teams that just either just take the opening or the closing to engage, or just take the stronger or weaker team.
So I recommend that firstly, you take at least 3 across your team. If you're taking less than that, there are judges who will be counting and will notice. But secondly, you want to make sure that there's at least 1 from each team across that.
So, I mean, if you're in a team
Yep.
that tends to not get taken, is there any...
For getting taken, you can just sound a little bit outraged, but generally the judges noticed. They generally take track of it. So when I write down a POI that's been asked, I write down who it's from, and I'll look back and go, oh, no, you didn't take any POIs from opening gov. So they're generally, the judge is generally noticing. All you can do is try and make that fairly obvious, make it really clear that you're standing up to offer POIs, so be a little bit louder offering them to make sure that the judges notice that you are actually giving them an opportunity. In terms of taking them as a team, the other thing I'd say is to think about kind of when it's difficult to ask a good POI. So if I'm Prime Minister, I would normally take a point of information from closing op, because they don't know what their opening is going to say yet, and so it puts them in a difficult position. They have to give something away in order to ask a POI. That means that I have more opportunity to respond to their material. Vice versa, if I'm a closing half team, I will tend to try and preferably take POIs from the opening, because I want to demonstrate that we're ahead of them. And you also obviously then spend a bit of time thinking about who the stronger teams in the room are as well. So who you need to spend more time engaging with.
I sometimes take 2 POIs as a Prime Minister.
Yep.
Because I feel like it's more possible to have a bit of more engagement. Like
Yep.
both teams.
So I think that a lot of that is personal preference. So for context, my debating partner and I used to do it so that whoever was speaking first took 1, whoever was speaking second took 2. So in opening half, he'd take 1 at Prime Minister and I'd take 2 at Deputy, and in closing half, I'd take 1 at Extension and he'd take 2 in Whip, because we felt that those were the speeches that had more space in them for that kind of thing. But people have different preferences, and you should be working with your partner to work out how you best do that, and it should be something that's an agreed upon strategy, rather than a situation where you sit down after Prime Minister and go, sorry, I only got a chance to take 1, you'll have to take 2. It should be something that you plan.
Worst case scenario, assuming like I'm opening a position and closing up the knives me, and I'm scared that the judge won't get that. Should I point that out in the POI?
Yeah, usually. It depends on the knife. The knife might favour you. People sometimes forget that about knives. Knives can sometimes fix problems. So sometimes you might have run an argument that's really quite contradictory, and they've said, look, we're not going to defend that, and moved on, and you might just let them get away with it, unless you have a good argument for why that argument can stay in the debate without contradicting other material. On the other hand, if they've just knifed you gratuitously just for the sake of it, then you might point it out. That said, be careful and think about the tactics of it. So one of my favourite tactical debates of all time that I've done was the Berlin Octos, which was about cutting off military aid to Egypt. And we were closing Gulf. And our opening made the debate very heavily about the need to promote a military coup in Egypt. So it was right after Morsi had been elected. There's obviously a lot of worry that he was going to take the country in a problematic and extremist direction. They were like, we need the military to step in, run a coup, and hold new elections. And so it was very much for them about military power and using that in Egypt. And we sat down, we were closing government, we were like, we've got a problem here. They've done most of this material as well as is roughly possible. We actually don't think this is the best material in the debate, but if we stick in terms of what they think is the most important goal, then they'll win. Closing op, who's quite good, will beat us because they've had heaps of time to think about it. There's no way for us to build on this material. We have to shift it in a new direction. And so we went, actually, one of the features of a military coup for a new election is going to, and they've said it's going to be, a new constitution. That constitution is probably going to increase democratic power and strength of democratic power. The biggest problem in Egypt is actually military dominance of Egypt. So we're going to make the debate about that. And at first, our opening gulf were kind of outraged at the bench. They're like, you're knifing us, this is terrible, and I'm getting increasingly angry. And then as it went on, they realized that actually we were quite happy to back them. We just thought there was an additional thing that was coming along. And as it turned out, the closing op spent all of their time saying, but it's a knife, and promptly came fourth because they had no other responses to the material in the debate. So sometimes the strategies playing out might be much more complicated. And so by the end of that debate, the opening gov were quite happily hearing everything that we were saying because it suited them tactically for the judges watching the debate to go, yeah, that's totally consistent, and just award it as a gov bench debate rather than anything more complicated. So it can be important for you not to go, they're knifing. Sometimes you need to step back and think about why they might be doing it and what the other tactics in the room are. I think actually the most important bit of tactics, and I can't teach it to you, it's something you have to learn for yourselves, is actually understanding why other teams are doing what they're doing. What are they attempting to set up? How are they attempting to build it? So in similarly, the failure in that debate from the closing ops perspective is a failure to just engage with our material and make it all about us. Right? So they went, we can call a knife and we can knock out this quite good team. But in fact, if they'd instead gone, yeah, the debate is totally all about that, they would have had a much better chance of shutting out the opening government from the debate, and it would have been a closing half debate. But because of how they respond and how they adapt, they get knocked out. So thinking about those tactics can be really important, thinking about why someone's doing what they're doing and what they're setting up for you and what opportunities are available to you. If there's a really good team in a room and they feel like they've kind of got a bit of flexibility to move around, they might well be choosing who they think it's easiest to bring along with them. And you want them to think that's you, because they'll adapt their strategy around that. Okay, so let's maybe talk a little bit about material in opening half before we do.
So the question, it kind of regards the whole audio knifing thing. So if you're opening and you get completely misrepresented,
Yep.
but you no longer have a chance to speak,
Yep.
Is there anything you can do to not rely on the judge to actually notice it? Because often you might not.
Yeah, so you probably would in those situations ask a Pairwise. Sometimes a misrepresentation doesn't hurt you, right? So sometimes you might be sitting there thinking, wow, that argument was killer. The judge was nodding all the way through it. The judge clearly thinks it's a great argument. They've totally misrepresented it. The judge looks really angry. I'm just going to let them continue. I don't want the risk that they actually respond to this properly. So sometimes you might be in a situation where you just might let it slide, right? But sometimes you might flag it. And in fact, that'll probably be the majority of the time where you'll stand up and say, look, you're completely missing the point of our argument. It's not this, it's this. Can you respond to the actual argument we presented? And you just want to sound a little bit outraged that they missed the point rather than kind of going too full blown on it. Anything else people want to ask about that? Pairwise? Any other Pairwise questions?
A few times I've heard people asking several questions in one POI, which has often led to the speaker being somewhat confused and not responding to them properly.
Yep. Wave them down. So I would.
Don't finish the sentence. Just sit.
Yeah, just sit down. If someone's put a question mark in the sentence, they're done, right? So you get one question in that POI, and it is one question. If they've finished that one question, they no longer have any more time to speak. Doesn't matter if it's only taken them 3 seconds to say it. They don't get to just stand up and waffle for 15 seconds. So the first thing I would say is wave them down. Got the point of your question. Yep, going to respond to it now. The second thing to say is to not ask questions like that. If you're going to ask a double-barreled POI, it needs to build naturally. So there needs to be a sense that, oh yeah, that makes sense. Those two things do actually go together. And it needs to be clear to everyone in the room. So not just the speaker, but also the judge. You want the judge to understand why that POI is being asked. That make sense? Okay. Let's talk about opening half. So in general, in the kind of ideal world, what would happen is you would be an opening government team, you'd identify the biggest issues in the debate, and you'd win them, and that would be it, right? The tactics for the opening half should be fairly simple. Because you don't have as much interaction going on, and you have the opportunity to run any argument you can think of, you should have the ability, if you're kind of at your best form, to just run the best arguments and leave everyone else with nowhere else to go, right? In reality, that's really difficult because you only get 15 minutes, and in fact, you don't even get 15 minutes because you're running to a room. And in fact, you don't even get that because you're also panicked and stressed, right? So in reality, you will very rarely do that. In practice, as a result, teams try and take kind of 3 approaches to the debate. So trying to pick that core issue is one of them, right? So trying to identify what the core issues in the debate genuinely are and spending a lot of prep time kind of calmly thinking through how they'd build a case to just hit those really core points is one strategy you can take. You can also try and cover the field as much as possible. So I'm going to refer to that as Mattock Wrapping for the purposes of this. It's not because that's a term that's kind of has a technical usage in debating. It's just useful to have one for the purposes of this. So just trying to cover everything. There's some pros and cons of that, which we'll talk about in a moment. Or trying to so resoundingly analyze one particular area of the debate that it just by default becomes the core area. So that might be a situation where you know a lot about a topic and you think there's actually what it would normally be quite an esoteric point about that debate, but you think you know enough to make it sound like the most important material in the debate, and you think no one else in the debate is going to know enough to respond to it. So you might choose to just spend all of your energy analysing to make that point sound really important, so that everyone else has to argue the debate on your terms. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these options, so we're going to go through them. So the first of them, which I'm going to refer to as kind of just winning the issue, is actually quite tricky because you have to know what the issue is. And that's actually genuinely often quite difficult. As a general rule, I think that this should be the first starting point of most teams. The others are tactically more difficult to execute. So I think most teams should kind of start going into prep by saying, what's the core issue? Can we find it? And it's only when you can't or you're not entirely certain that you might decide to do something more complicated. As a general rule, it's easier to run a couple of good points of material well and devote most of your energy to analysing them as best as possible rather than convincing people that they're important in the first place. But sometimes that's going to be difficult. So there's some other tactics you might choose to use. The first of those is Mattock Wrapping, which we spoke about for a moment. It obviously involves rapid fire coverage of as many arguments as possible, which means it has some real pitfalls. The first of those is that you become inconsistent because you're running so many arguments that actually they don't fit together. And a lot of young teams try and do this and do it badly as a result because they think of so many ideas and they're like, these are all genius, and they run them all and actually they're all mutually contradictory and it's a mess. So you've got to learn to filter. And you also have to learn that you have a limited amount of time. If you try and run everything, so if you try and run 5 arguments, you won't have time to run all of them. And that means that you miss pieces of analysis and that leaves space for your closing half to fill in the space and take those arguments for their own. So you have to think about how much time you realistically have if you're going to do this. On the other hand, you can shut out your closing half completely because you leave them with no material. If you cover everything really well, they've got nothing to say. And you can bog down your opposition in rebuttal. So they have so many different things to respond to. And you can, if they kind of respond to one point quite well, you can drop that and amp up the focus on something else. So they have to cover everything. And that puts them in a really difficult position. So if you can do this well, it's very effective, but it's also tricky to do well.
I guess especially for yourself.
Yes. And I mean,
Read all the times.
yeah, and it's...
What's the word?
And it also just genuinely, and Danique and I have a lot of chats about this, it's just genuinely the extra time you have to spend thinking for not like a word for something, as most of you are at the point where that's not difficult. It's the perfect word to encapsulate that concept and the ability to, as a result, skip an entire sentence, which not for every person who's in English as a first language speaker, a lot of them are also still terrible at that, but there is an advantage when you've kind of been speaking a language since birth, that you have a greater and wider vocabulary and you can target words that allow you to skip over some time. That can be a difficulty for it. I think there are some ESL speakers who do it very, very well. I think Syed Sadiq from Malaysia, from IAUM, does a really good job of some of this. So there's an opportunity for you to do that and develop that skill. And that by no means should you think that because you're ESL you can't, but you've got to think carefully about how much time you realistically have available to you. And the flip side of that as well, I think genuinely, is that for a lot of ESL speakers, in fact, the knowledge of a language as a second language means you have a more technical understanding of it. And so you actually have a greater awareness of the very specific meaning of words. Whereas for a lot of English as a primary language speakers, they're just used to using them without necessarily the understanding going on behind it. So there can be some genuine advantages to having that more technical understanding of the language when it comes to doing these kind of things. Third one we're going to talk about is obviously matter dumping. This involves actually knowing something. I don't think you can do this without knowing a lot about a topic. So the best example I have as a way to illustrate this is, it used to be the case, battery's running low, I'll plug that in a moment. It used to be the case that a lot of tournaments would set very short worded motions that would actually, as a result, have the potential to be about multiple things. So the best example I have for this one is this house supports a two-state solution, which used to get set perennially, right? Everyone just assumed it was about Israel, because every time it was set, it was debated as if it was about Israel. But there are heaps of places where you could support a two-state solution. right? So if you get that topic, and let's say Belgium's been in the news a bit, and you know a lot about Belgium and the fact that their politics is a little bit broken, you might decide that you've got enough knowledge to convince a judge that while they might have assumed this debate was about Israel, actually it's totally legitimate on the wording of it and the fact that there's a context out there for you to make this debate about Belgium, and everyone else is going to struggle to respond to that. The problem is, the judge might not believe you. So if you're going to pick something that you just know a lot about and be like, this debate is actually really about this, believe us, you have to be able to do it really, really well. And you can see more subtle versions of this if you go back and watch the Chennai Grand Final. I think actually the biggest triumph of the Harvard team that goes on to win is that they convince the opposition of a whole bunch of very odd things about the Indian economy. For example, they convince everyone in the debate that in fact the reason that India has currency controls is to stop foreigners investing rather than to stop Indians with money in India moving it all out. Which, if you think about the nature of India's economy, is a fairly implausible premise. But they convinced everyone to argue the debate on those terms. So there are teams that do this exceptionally well, and it can be not just about tricking your adjudicator, but genuinely convincing everyone else in the debate that you just must know more. And of course, in their case, one of them had just done his PhD, I think, or his master's thesis on Indian economic regulation. And everyone in the debate knew that and all assumed that he knew what he was talking about, when in fact he was playing the cards. And a good team does that, and so you've got to be able to respond to that and think about that. We're going to take a pause because my computer's out of battery and I'm going to plug it in so I have access to all of my notes.
Shortly on this Harvard thing, actually it was a pretty big gamble that they took, because
Yeah.
they couldn't assume
That everyone else would meet that. No.
They could have also had the second option, the team knew exactly because the first
Yes.
option.
So that's the gamble, right? If you stand up and make your case about something that's quite narrow and esoteric, the gamble is people don't play along.
And then it's also the judges, because they might just be inclined to not believe you because
Yeah.
they do know what's happening.
Yeah. And so that's the really tricky bit of those kind of tactics. The more tricky your tactics are, the more of a chance there is that everyone else in the debate will just go, we don't believe you. What are you talking about? That's not this debate. So you have to be willing to be flexible, and you have to be a little bit imaginative about how you kind of bring people along with you.
But in that case, so if you don't know anything about Belgium and you're also somewhat skeptical that the judges believe that a two-state solution is about
Then you wouldn't do
Belgium,
it. Yeah.
And as an op team, what do you...
Then you might, the problem is, as an op team, you don't want to just do a definitional challenge. So the reason that's a quite good example is because no one in their right mind definitionally challenges something that is debatable, right? Definitional challenges are messy. They take up all your time arguing about whether something is a correct definition or not. You have no time left for analysis. So they will lose you the debate, or the closing half teams will win. So no one wants to do them, which is why sometimes people will kind of push the envelope when it comes to interpreting motions. I mean, I talk about that one almost as a joke. I think it probably would be borderline illegitimate if a team were to do it. And I never did it myself. I was always very tempted, but was never doing a tournament that I cared little enough about to take the risk. But it is, I think there are often problems with wording that are exploitable. The question is, do you think people will come along with you if you do it? And that is a gamble.
So as an op team, I would say, well, a reasonable person would of course assume this debate is about Israel, but that's...
And you would lose, yeah. So you might stand up and be like, look, this is not the debate we were expecting to have, but fine, here are the principled reasons why it's better for countries to stay as single countries rather than separate. And I mean, you might also be quite happy because arguing that it's possible to make a single state solution work in Israel-Palestine can also be quite difficult. So you might feel that even though you don't know very much, this might actually be a cleaner debate and an easier and more principled one. Yeah.
How much can the judge penalize you if, for example, you make a debate about Belgium and Belgium turns out to be a very specific case that actually works out completely different and Palestine is just hypothetically like...
Well, I mean, debates can go in different directions. There's nothing wrong with that. So if you run a debate in a way that is kind of unexpected, it doesn't mean you're automatically losing speaker points. You might automatically get more because you've kind of done something that's more imaginative and more interesting. It all is going to come down to how well you do the case. Now, if you make the debate about Belgium and it turns out to be a terrible debate, your adjudicator is going to be in a bad mood, and they're human, and you will probably suffer the brunt of that. But in a world in which you do something unexpected and do it well, judges tend to reward you. All right, any other thoughts on that, or should we move on to closing half?
Can I have a question? I mean, I don't know if you
No, never that. So you should have substantive material at deputy. It is a requirement of the format that you present new material at deputy. You should do it. If you don't, judges are noticing. So yeah, you need to run your own substantive material, and there needs to be a point of having the deputy speaker, right? They're there for a reason. You're supposed to do something that's not just respond. You've got to have something that is a new contribution to the debate. Now that might be merge, rebuttal, and substantive. There's nothing wrong with that, but there still needs to be something in your speech that you can point to and go, this is why I was here. Yeah.
Maybe we can talk shortly about the prep strategy for the...
Yeah, let's do that at the end. Yeah. So I want to talk quickly about closing half, just because obviously my notes are on a computer that's charging and I don't want to forget them before I speak. So when it comes to closing half, there are again more choices that you can make, and I think those choices become harder to choose between because they become more even. So obviously in some circumstances, your opening will have entirely fluffed the debate, right? They'll have done a terrible job. All of the core arguments are left to you. The trick there is just to be willing to edit, right? You've got to have a bit of self-control about how much you take on. So if your opening has done nothing but talk about fluffy kittens for 14 minutes, and you have every possible argument you've thought of to run, still only run 3 of them, don't run them all, right? You still have to edit, and remember that you only get to run substantive material in your extension speaker's speech, so you have to have everything fit in there. If you try and cram too much in, you won't be able to analyse it. So there are still some restrictions, even if your opening half has done nothing. In most cases, your opening half will have done something, and the question is what you add on and how you do it. I think there are 2 criteria for a good extension, and which one of these is more tricky depends on what your opening has done. The first of those is obviously novelty. So you need to have a really novel extension. It needs to be new. It needs to be something that's attributable to you specifically, rather than just your opening. Otherwise, your opening will just win, okay? It also, though, needs to be relevant, right? It needs to be core and central to the debate. And you as a closing half team will often have something that doesn't meet either of those criteria. And the trick is going to be the analysis and the framing that you do to make it sound novel or to make it sound relevant, right? So which of those things you spend more time on depends on what type of extension you're running. And there, again, I'm going to use some terminology here that doesn't widely get used. I think it's just useful in terms of thinking about it, which is both wedge and reset extensions. So a wedge extension is something that you might do if your opening is run wedge. So wedge, driving a wedge into a space. Yep. If your opening is run lots of material, right? They've covered the field. You're probably going to have to find small gaps in their case that you can wedge new material into, right? So yes, they've talked about role of government, but this link here they've done a poor job of. That's a new contribution we can make. Yes, they've talked about effect on women, but they've done it quite vaguely. Here's some new bits that we can make. So you're driving new material into the space. And the reason it's a wedge is there's a very small point they're missing. You want to fit as much into that space as possible. So you're trying to drive a wedge into it and make it sound like that's a big gap so that it sounds really important. Does that make sense? Yep.
So if you have a situation when your opening is pretty good, but the opposition is kind of shitty,
yep,
and they made most of the arguments, they didn't do it brilliantly, but they're still standing. And it's happened that I've had feedback that yes, you analyzed both your points a lot better, but they were already standing. With
that's bad judging. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it does mean you need to do some analysis about why that gap exists and why that gap exists even if the other side hasn't called it out. Right? So you might need to stand up and say, yes, the opening op has let them get away with this, but there is a gap in the opening gov's case that we need to address, and it's this, and here's why it's important. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about, so this is where you're dealing with novelty, right? So this is where you're saying, this gap that we're filling is important, it's novel, it's new because of this, right? On the flip side, you might have an opening half team that's talked about, say, the 3 very core issues in a great deal of detail, and there's nothing you can add to them, right? So, but you've got the 4th and the 5th issue in the debate, right? And you think they are definitely the 4th and 5th issue in the debate, right? They are not the most important material that's available to you. What you're doing there is a reset extension. You're saying the debate's been about this. We think it should be about these things instead, and we're going to explain why those are more important. Does that make sense? And you can see there, you don't have to talk about novelty. Everyone agrees with you that material's new. No one else has spoken about it. You shouldn't have to prove that to a judge. All you have to do is prove that material is relevant and important to the debate. Does that make sense? So depending on what your opening has done, you have to shift your focus. And it's not necessarily the focus of what has gone into the argument in terms of proving the argument. It's the extra focus that you have to put on proving that argument is either new or important. Does that make sense? Okay, we said we were going to have a chat about tactics in terms of prep, in terms of coming up with arguments. Should we talk about that for opening half first, do we think?
I still have a question.
Yes.
I have to leave in like 10 minutes. What would you say is the biggest advantage in terms of tactics that you've learned from Australs when you switched to BP? Is there like because like
we're taught,
extensions are very foreign
so
to
we're taught a bunch of things in Austral's format. When we swap to BP, we're taught a bunch of things ab initio, right? So you've spent 6 months learning how to do analysis, and then someone comes along and says, and there's this thing called Pairwise. And there's this thing called extensions, right? What that means, though, is that we tend to see them as like very distinct features in their own right, whereas someone who learns BP as their first debating format often just sees them as part of a kind of melange of how you argue. So Australian and New Zealand and Asian debaters, I find, tend to think more carefully about extensions and Pairwise because to us they are novel and new. And so our experience of them is as something that stands alone from just analysing. And I think if you can duplicate that sense, that's a real advantage. If you can think about them as something that is kind of different and has to have special focus placed on it, that gives you an advantage. Tactically.
Yeah, but how do I do that?
It's just a matter of constant awareness of them, which comes naturally if you're not used to having them, right? Because you have to be aware of them or you won't do them. Whereas for you guys, you've kind of started debating in BP, you've learnt debating with those things there, you're used to them being there, and it's easy for them to feel comfortable and for you to take them for granted. You just want to make it feel a bit newer every now and then. And there's no kind of magic trick to doing that, it's just a matter of focus and awareness. Yep. All right. Tactics when it comes to prep. I think there are more tactics when it comes to prep for the closing half than for the opening. Opening, you usually don't have enough time to do kind of anything amazingly complicated in terms of prep tactics, right? You obviously need to spend your time wisely, but you're going to be spending that time coming up with arguments, writing arguments, stand up, speak. There's very little extra thinking time in that. So the most important thing for you to do is be just aware of the clock. And I recommend starting a timer. I recommend not necessarily sticking rigidly to a schedule. So sometimes you might say, well, this topic is actually very simple. We've done this 5 times before. Do we need to brainstorm? No, we're going to skip brainstorm. We're going to go right to talking about how we're going to run the arguments. So you don't want to bind yourself into anything too rigid. As a general rule, I'd recommend that you spend walking time brainstorming, right? So if you don't have to walk, that's maybe 2 to 3 minutes. And then start talking. Spend maybe 3 to 4 minutes getting arguments down, working out what exactly it is you're going to run, and then dive straight into writing the case. And you'll obviously still talk as you do that, and you'll ask each other questions, but you'll have a sense of what order things go in, why you're doing them, and you want to have that within the first half of your prep time, if that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. And concerning the first half teams,
Yes.
Normally teams together invest a lot of time into the speech of the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Because it's the first speech and it's really, you only have these 15 minutes and then the deputy is kind of left with whatever.
Yeah. So as a deputy speaker, I recommend that you continue to put your focus on the Prime Minister. So I think it can be difficult for the deputy, and it does mean that deputies need to be a little bit more self-sufficient, but you have more time and people forget that. So I used to say, I think as a general rule, as an opening gov team, the deputy can walk into the room with no material, because the Prime Minister's immediately going to stand up and speak for 7 minutes, and you have 7 more minutes where you know what they're saying, and so you can focus on your case. That's harder if you're opposition, because the first thing that's going to happen is the Prime Minister's speech, which you're going to need to think about responses for. So you'll have less time to kind of spend thinking about your own deputy material. So I would recommend that you worry a little bit more about that when you're on the opposition than when you're on the government.
Yes.
But when you're on the opposition, your opposition leader has more time to frame their speech. Yeah. So it matters less that you spend the time there. So in terms of opening gov, really do put that focus on the Prime Minister, and you might just walk in with headings as a deputy speaker that you then flesh out while your Prime Minister's speaking. When you're on the opposition, you might devote a little bit more time in prep to getting your arguments onto the page.
Yeah. To really understand and decide which arguments you would do.
Yeah.
I think there's also an advantage if you don't have a lot of material prepared yet. You're also more
And once you're comfortable speaking from very short notes, the less time between you writing your speech and you delivering it, usually the better speech it will be.
But for the deputy prime minister, it's also, I mean, he has to do a couple of things. Like, he first has to deal with, like, the leader of the opposition.
Yep.
He also needs to rebuild everything that got attacked from the prime
Yep.
minister. Plus, he has to actually bring
Yep.
some kind of new substantive.
Which, but that also means, so first response, which is so kind of the deputy prime minister and the opposition leader, I think are two of the hardest positions in VP debating, because you have to do all of that.
Yeah.
You have to build a case and rebuild a case and respond, and so they are very difficult positions to do. The result of that is you often tend to run a little bit less substantive than you might otherwise, and it also means that you do things like merge, rebuttal, and substantive more actively, because you kind of are writing speeches that are trying to do so many different things that you have to do some of them at the same time.
Yeah.
That makes sense? Yep. When it comes to closing half, I think prep time is harder, kind of counterintuitively, because you obviously have more time, but I think there are also more traps to fall into. And the biggest of those is coming up with an extension that you think is brilliant and just running it no matter what happened, which teams do all the time. So you have to think a little bit creatively about how you stop yourself committing to an extension. And then on the flip side, you also have to think a little bit carefully about how you avoid ruling out extensions before they need to be ruled out. And I normally do this with a whiteboard. I don't have one, so we're going to kind of have to imagine what I'm writing. But so one of the most important things for you to do is to network arguments together when you're in prep, particularly as a closing half team, because you might have to run one of those quite complicated little wedgy arguments as an extension. You want to know the components of arguments so that you're not crossing off the entirety of role of government because the opening half has mentioned it. You're crossing off the elements of that, and you're crossing off the ways that it interacts with other arguments. So when I'm in closing half, I tend to write notes in prep as a mind map. So the topic will have a bunch of different arguments around it, and those will be networked together. So if we're doing a topic about legalizing prostitution, I'll write, rights of women, risks of harm to prostitutes, and I'll link those because those are going to be interrelated. There are parts of those arguments that depend on each other. And so when they run one half of that, I still know that there's another angle of approach to get to the same material and another way that I can use that material. Whereas if you just write down effect on women and leave it there, you're not going to have any of that knowledge. And so when you sit in the debate, you'll go, oh, well, they've done that. But you're not thinking about how it networks together and what interrelates with what. So I think, in fact, closing half, that prep time can be crucial because it's how you build a sense of what material interrelates with what other material so that you have extensions to run. So often when I do these sessions, like the first question I get asked when we talk about closing half tactics is, but what if you just don't have anything to say? There's no way that any motion we set can be covered fully in 14 minutes. There is always something. The trick is being able to find it. And that means you have to have a really detailed understanding of how everything fits together.
What if I have a partner and they don't stick to what we've prepared and maybe goes crazy and claims that...
Yes, get a new partner. I mean, there's nothing you can do. So partnerships are really important in VP debating, and if you've got a partner who's not sticking to the script, you can try and correct that, but there's nothing that will replace replacing the partner. So you will never, there's no way to get yourself into the same position as if they had run a brilliant speech. All you can do is kind of minimize the problems, but you have to also be flexible yourself. If you've got a partner, this obviously happens particularly with pro-am teams where they panic and do something a bit weird, you have to be willing to roll with it. So they might have done something a bit weird, you have to find the good in it. You have to find the bits that are rescuable rather than just standing up and running your own material. Because if you do that, then you're both knifing and often running new material at whip, which you can't do.
And how do you communicate with your whip speaker about, because sometimes, of course, it's not possible to say, oh, this is our extension and fine, and whip speaker can actually think about it.
So when I was doing extension speeches at Worlds, I used to just not tell my partner. He wasn't good at them. It was fine. I shouldn't say that. He wasn't terrible at them. But
This was online.
Yeah, he's fine. This will be fine about it. He knows all of this.
It's not in the internet.
But so yeah, he'd be fine anyway. But that was not his focus. He was focusing on how the entire debate fit together. And so I might give him a couple of headings, and sometimes he'd understand that, but that would be it. And then he would just listen very closely to my speech. That doesn't work for everyone.
Yeah.
So sometimes you need to give a little bit more, and sometimes they might be better at coming up with extensions. People assume that if you're speaking extension, you're the best place to come up with an extension.
Yeah.
That is not always true.
Yeah.
So it should be a communicative pathway, but a lot of that communication happens long before the debate. It's about how do you prefer to be communicated with. So the one thing I did used to do was I'd give him my notes. So as I finished a section of my extension, I would hand it to him to read. My handwriting was terrible. He got used to it, but the kind of, he would be able to see what I was going to be speaking from, and even if that didn't give him the exact nuance of each element, he would have a general sense, and then he might ask a couple of follow-up questions.
Would you also read his notes on the
No, because by that point we knew what the case was. The reason it was important from an extension speaker perspective was I didn't have time to talk.
Because sometimes I feel there's like a discontinuity between what the extension speaker emphasizes and what the whip speaker emphasizes, and that is not only because
So
sometimes it's hard to talk.
The one thing that I used to do was the second I sat down after giving my extension speech, I would say, here are the focal points. Now that you've heard the extension, you know what I was trying to do, you've generally listened to that and built that into your extension, your whip speech, here are the things that we have to focus on from that. And so it is about finding the moments for the communication, and it's about talking to your partner about the way that you would prefer to communicate. And particularly for partnerships that have gone on for a while, you start to build a shorthand for that. And so I would sometimes just lean over and say, you know, that argument we ran the other week in this debate, we're doing it again.
Yeah, in terms of just what she said, when I choose my clash points as a whip speaker, does it make sense to say, okay, before the debate starts, those are going to be my clash points, and I'll just try, unless I'm completely off the
Yeah,
topic,
I would not do
I'll
that.
just try to fit stuff in.
I would not do that. The first reason is because you want to be able to emphasize your extension, and that means that you need to be able to make that sound like the most important thing in the debate. And if you're running off issues that you wrote before the debate even started, it's going to be really difficult to do that. So I generally would try and come up with like maybe one or maybe even 2 points of clash or themes by the end of the opening half, but I would not feel like those were set in stone. And you've got to be willing to kind of throw everything out and start again if something odd happens, which it does sometimes, because sometimes the other closing team stands up and runs something completely unexpected.
Because I feel like sometimes, whip speakers also, and I think because it is easier, the first half is easy to listen to, and you have the clash points and everything.
And you can think about it really carefully.
Hopefully your partner answers to all clash points, obviously, and
But not always.
And on all the sides of the debate, but often it's not the case,
Yep.
or he introduces or she introduces something new, and then that needs to be the first
Yep.
clash point, and then it's not possible to shift around the material.
Yeah.
because it's
So you've got to remain flexible. I wouldn't be writing down too much until you get into the closing half and at least know what your own extension is. That's not a hard and fast rule. Sometimes it's really obvious that a debate is going to stay on a particular pathway and you can write things down. But I think this is the mistake people make. I really object to people referring to whip speeches as summary speeches because they are not summaries. A whip speech should not just summarize everything that happened in the debate. It should whip the debate, and that's a really different thing. It means you might not mention something that was said in opening at all, right? There might be an argument that the other opening team made a huge deal about, and it might get one line because you don't need to summarize it. You want your role is not to summarize, it's to show why your material was most important. And you're going to talk about other people's material in the process, but there's no summary in that. You don't have to touch everything.
Yeah. It's the same goes with extension speaker in the sense
Yeah.
that they also listen to the first half and then try to build on that, and then sometimes
Yep.
after the most important point is the last.
Exactly. I think also people get way too rigid about structure when it comes to building kind of order of points in closing half. There's no reason your rebuttal has to come first. We just do it by default. So you should be thinking creatively about what structure of argumentation suits the material that you're bringing to the debate. And particularly in extension, where you're often trying to say the debate wasn't about that, it was about this completely different thing, spending 3 minutes or 4 minutes first talking about something that you don't think the debate is about is a weird thing to be doing. So you want to be thinking creatively about how you structure your speech to make it clear that the debate is actually about something that you're going to be talking about.
Can I not do that with rebuttal and my substantive?
Yeah, you can do merge rebuttal and substantive. I used to do rebuttal at the end a lot. So I used to say, because of the nature of our extension, I'm going to start with that because it completely reframes how you should be thinking about the debate. And then the kind of superficial leftover rebuttal I'll do at the
Are
end.
there videos of you doing that?
Probably.
So like also in terms of the do the nummerization like in the very end, like where you would shift around. Because
Yeah, I mean, I would.
sometimes notes get so prefixed.
Yeah, yeah.
you can't
So I
just-
never. I used to number my points when I stood up.
Yeah.
I don't put them in an order until then.
Okay.
Because they shouldn't be. Because you don't know what's most important and what you need to start with until everything's happened. You might have a very good idea, but there's nothing guaranteeing that the speaker before you might not do something totally crazy in their last 30 seconds. And then you've got to be able to adapt. Yeah.
Well, understood how big the effect that is, but I would say if you put the rebuttal at the beginning, you'll very quickly undermine like the credibility of the other team.
But you
what
might undermine their
said-
credibility more by saying the debate's not even about that.
Okay.
And that's why you're doing it. So like it's still you responding. Nothing about VP is unresponsive. Everything you're doing is going to be responding to what other teams have done, regardless of whether you've integrated rebuttal or substantive or what order you've put it in. You've just got to think a little bit creatively about what order suits. And that doesn't mean that, I definitely don't recommend this for someone starting out in VP. It's useful to have a rigid structure when you first start, because that's something you can rely on as solid and stable when you're still learning how to argue. But the better you get at it, the more creative you should feel confident being. All right, those are all the thoughts I had on strategy. If there are any other questions, we can talk about them. We might want to do. I don't know what's the time. It's actually only still 11:30. Okay,
It's 12:43.
12:43. Yes, sorry, my phone wasn't catching up. There we go. So we might do. Do we want to do lunch now and then do something after lunch?